is the last in our formal adult education program of the season. But within the next 2 weeks, you're going to hear about the next series. We've got 3 programs coming up. In fact, there is a program, I just found out about it about 2 hours ago. We're going to have a live video with Rabbi Jonathan Sachs and Senator something, Lieberman, thank you, on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock here in the library. YU is putting it on. You'll get details, and I apologize for not sending it out earlier. Yeah, not tomorrow, not the next day, but the next day. Sunday. This coming Sunday. Again, I apologize, we just found out about it, and so those who can come, please do. There'll be another couple of interesting programs coming up, which we'll advise you for, but so this program, we're going to talk about Pesach. It is being sponsored by George and Florence Weinberger, commemorate the yahrzeit of George's father, Avram ben Yitzchak Isaac, and George's grandfather, Yitzchak Isaac ben Tzvi. He told me I didn't have to write it down, but I would for sure get it wrong if I didn't write it down. Shomash Yahav and Aliyah. And without any further ado, Rabbi Milevsky.
Okay, thank you for the sponsorship. Thank you all. Josh, is good there? Thank you. Good evening, everybody. We do thank you for coming. My mother, when she was 16, she graduated high school, and age 16, and she was sent from Cleveland, Ohio, to Israel for 2 years to study in some seminary. And during that period of time, she was informed, probably a telegram, that my grandfather will be visiting the region, meaning he's not going to make it to Israel, but he's going to be in London, England, for a brief visit, to visit his mother, who was there. And it was a very exciting opportunity for my mother, because it would be the first time and the only time for her to actually meet a grandparent, because my mother's maternal grandparents did not survive the war. Her father's father passed away in the 50s, and she had a grandmother. And of course, in those days, you didn't travel to see grandparents, and they did not have the financial means. So this was an opportunity to make it to London, England, to visit a grandmother. It was very exciting for her. And she flies in so she's in Israel, she flies to London, she meets her father who's there, and she meets the grandmother. So they're staying together there in this apartment somewhere in London. And my mother is getting dressed for some kind of occasion. A 17-year-old girl wants to look good. And she had a little bit of a shaila about her button. In other words, how much does she have to close? Maybe perhaps she wanted to know Minad London. So this was the shaila she had. So she asks her father, and my grandfather Zaidi says, listen, we're here in grandma, whatever they called her, in her house, in Oma's house. Ask her. So she comes with her shaila to her German grandmother, and she asks her, what's the appropriate way to close the button here? So the grandmother grabs her collar, closes it with the button that my mother did not expect would ever be closed, and she says, this is how we do it here. We don't follow these Litvische kulis, like the Litvische. Leniencies of the Litvische. We don't follow them. You hear this? And it seemed to be that this harsh statement, right, was a curse upon my mother, because she landed up with a Litvische. My father was a Litvische, and he was a Litvische who knew a few kulis. He actually knew a few leniencies. And as a child, growing up, I already understood that there are different schools regarding halacha at a very young age. I knew that at home, right, on Shabbos, if you want something from the refrigerator and the light is out, you open the refrigerator and you close it. By the grandparents, who at that time were in Cleveland, Ohio, by the Yekim, what you do is that when you want something from the refrigerator, you walk to the refrigerator and you wait. And you wait. And you stand there and you meditate and you shuckle and you have a conversation and you have an argument. And then when the motor starts, that's when you open up and you immediately try to take out as many items as possible. Why? Because there's a halacha concern that when you open the refrigerator, perhaps some warm air will go in, affect the thermostat, kick it on. So the Litvisha could find the leniency, the Yeke cannot. So I was familiar and aware of the different schools that existed. So today we're going to go ahead and take a little bit of a Litvish approach. However, at the same time, I want to make it very, very clear that minhagim, customs, are important, right? They're our identity. And if a person has a minhag, and as we'll explain soon, has the ability to stick to the minhag and it will not damage his Judaism, the minhag is important. However, it is extremely important to be balanced, to be sure that minhagim have their place. But when you go ahead and allow minhagim to turn into a monster that eats up the core of Judaism, then we have a problem that has to be dealt with. In other words, for example, the halacha tells us that if you are aware that there are people who wash their walls for Pesach, you shouldn't laugh at them. You shouldn't laugh at them. In other words, there are those who have these customs that are not really required halachically. Nevertheless, they do it, respect it. For you to do it, that's a very different question that has to be addressed. And that seems to be what I want to deal with. And message number one, for example, if you take an approach that every crumb is chametz, and as a result, for the 6 weeks or 8 weeks leading to Pesach, you are fighting crumbs and getting upset about crumbs, right? Or if you up it and believe that dust is chametz, and for the 8 weeks prior to Pesach, you are fighting dust, and dust becomes your enemy, and you have to wash curtains because of the dust. And as a result, you develop a hatred towards what the Torah wants you to enjoy. The Torah tells us, "V'samachta b'chagecha." Now, we understand very well that naturally there are things that perhaps are going to be difficult. In other words, Yom Kippur. It's an important day, by the way, right? You're supposed to be thankful for the concept of Yom Kippur. And yes, you will be hungry. There are things in Judaism we accept. We accept the fact that for some of us, the diet of Pesach, even the Torah law diet, will have a little bit of a negative impact on the digestive system. We accept it in Judaism, right? There are realities. Sukkot, right? There is a reality that for some there's a level of discomfort eating in a sukkah. There's actually a statement by the Rambam that the whole purpose of the sukkah is that after Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, when you come back home, you enjoy your home and you learn to appreciate what you have. So obviously that statement of the Rambam is indicating that there are things that even though you're supposed to be happy, you will be struggling with those things that limit your happiness. We accept that. But to create an environment and to adapt customs that destroy the essence of the holiday, that is extremely problematic and have to be addressed. So that's message number one. Keep it balanced, right? Know what is a must, know what's not. You realize that, technically speaking, according to the halacha, a crumb that is dirty is not chametz. So therefore, halachically speaking, there is absolutely no need to even vacuum this room. You want to make this room Pesach, right? I could do it within 4 to 5 minutes, right? There is no requirement to vacuum for Pesach. Now, I'm not telling you not to vacuum at home. But the point we are trying to make is understand what is required, what is not. And do not add to it, right? The people who go ahead and make spring cleaning into part of Pesach, and as a result, Pesach becomes a very agitating holiday, that is a problem. It's got to be cut out. And it's a very important message, especially for a generation that has been taught that you stick to everything that was done at home. not the case, because it could create more tsaris than achieving what Pesach is about. So just be mindful of that before we enter into any discussion. Now, I have a personal dream, mission, mishugas, and that is to have a production specifically of peanut oil for Pesach. Now you can ask me, what's wrong with me? Like what is it about peanut oil that I have such an interest in? Right? Why? So
You have shares in peanuts.
that's one, yes. Like people ask me what toothpaste I recommend for Pesach, so I say I recommend Colgate because I have shares in Procter and Gamble, right? So you are arguing that that me and Jimmy Carter have a partnership in some kind of peanut farm in Georgia, but that's not the case. Let me tell you the real story behind it. So the real story behind it is that, as we shall see very soon, peanuts technically are not kitniot. As we'll see very soon, oil, the way it's produced today, let me make it clear, is not really an issue of a problem on Pesach. Combining the two together, there's no reason that there should be a problem. And therefore, in the 1940s and 1950s, when in South America, in Montevideo, Uruguay, the rabbi wanted to know about the status of peanut oil, so he sends a letter to Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, the rabbi in Yerushalayim, and he told him that it's 100% fine. And of course, the rabbi in Montevideo, Uruguay, is my grandfather. So I always felt this level of responsibility of bringing peanut oil back into the marketplace. Okay, that's a home, as they say, a dream. But with that, I ask the following question. We know very well that the study of history is important, but we have to be mindful of the fact that I do not have the right to find a custom that died a century ago, 3 centuries ago, or perhaps 1,000 years ago, and make it part of Judaism. It's a very dangerous approach to Judaism. For example, if let's say we declare that our congregation, we have a problem that during Kriyas HaTorah, there's talking. How could it be? It's a true problem. So now I'm going to make the following solution, that I found out that in the 8th century, the minhag in Israel at that time was, in Israel, Eretz Israel, that they would only read a third of the weekly portion. There was such a practice that existed. So I'm going to go ahead and declare this coming Shabbos, I'm going to clap, and I'm saying, Rabbosai, from now on, we're only going to read a third of the Parsha. So what we're going to do is, we're going to read a third, and the amount of time it takes to read the other 2/3, you could talk, but keep it quiet during Kriyas HaTorah. Now, how do you think that would fly? Won't work, right? People would not be happy. You could try it. So now, why not? It was done in the past. Everyone agrees that it was done in the past. There's even a reference to it in the Talmud. So obviously, the system of what keeps us together is minhag, the way, the structure that existed. That is something that we are very, very sensitive to, not to go ahead and change minhagim. So now the question is, if I decide to go ahead and bring peanut oil back, which for the past 25 years, I would argue, most of us are not using it at home, right? I remember, right, that there was peanut oil. And I'm sure that others remember it even better, that peanut oil was used. That's all there was. I am trying to figure out the dates of the vanishing of, where's peanut oil? Like, when did it vanish? I'm trying to figure it out.
Jimmy Carter became president.
That's what you're saying.
No, there would be more.
So we should stop playing basketball now, according to that. Now, so that's what I'm trying to figure out when it occurred. But nevertheless, my question is, is there an issue at all of me changing a minhag if I start bringing it and placing it, or let's say I work out with some kind of facility, I give them an ashgacha, my own ashgacha, I bring it to the shul office, we can make some money off it, we sell it through the shul office, kosher, lepesach, peanut oil, produced under supervision with my ashgacha, only to members of Bnei Torah. Maybe that we could deal with increasing membership through that. So the question is, am I violating any minhagim or not by doing it? Am I going against minhag? Everyone's giving me no. What?
When does the minhag establish?
Oh, so now comes the question, when does a minhag? In other words, we all agree. So I placed something, bringing a practice from 1,200 years ago, we all agree is a problem. Bringing a practice that vanished only 20 years ago seems to be okay. But I'm trying to figure out a scientific approach, and I'll give you the following. We know very well that in 1909, the chief rabbi of Yafo, Rab Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook, who eventually becomes the chief rabbi of Palestine. Rav Kook decides to give hashgacha on a production of sesame oil on Pesach. Now, sesame oil was in existence already in Israel centuries beforehand. And rabbis in general were against sesame oil, even Sfaradim. Reason being is because there were grains mixed in. And the process of making oil in the early 18th century was that you would add water to the sesames, cook it, extract the oil which was mixed and then separated from the water. And that obviously was a very serious problem because you had a mixture of wheat there. But by 1909, they were able to produce an oil that, number one, was dry roasted prior to extraction. And number two, it was water-free. And number three, that had absolutely no mixture of grain. So the new type of sesame oil produced in 1909 was problem-free, according to Rav Kook. So he goes ahead and gives us hashgacha. But the old yeshuv in Yerushalayim were extremely upset. They viewed it as breaking with the minhag. For centuries, we did not allow sesame oil. How can you, Rav Kook, allow it? So there was a big to-do between the two parties. The literature was published in a little booklet that I have a copy of in 1909 by Rav Kook. Very fascinating halachically because you have an understanding of the era, understanding of Rav Kook's philosophy, and you learn about the tension that existed in Israel and is still there. So you learn a little bit of history. Now, the question is, what if I go ahead and instead of, or in addition to our peanut oil production, I decide let's go for a sesame oil production? What's going to happen then? In other words, do you agree that that could be a little bit more of a question of minhag? Perhaps. Okay, that's something to deal with. Now, you say it's not a minhag. So let's start off with some history. Let's go through the history. The concept of kitniyot was unheard of until the 13th century. In the 13th century, there's a Rabbeinu Peretz living in northern France. Rabbeinu Peretz shares with us an old custom that we do not eat legumes during Pesach. That's what he notes as an old custom. We are told by contemporary authorities that when they heard of that practice, they thought it's a joke. They totally disagreed with it. So we know that in the 13th century, in France, which was the center of Torah Jewry in Europe at that time, we had those who believed it's a problem, those who believed that it is not. Why is there a problem? So you have one opinion. There was a rabbi by the name of Rabbeinu Manoach. Rabbeinu Manoach says that eating beans is not something you should be eating on Yom Tov. On Yom Tov you should eat good food. So therefore, Pesach is a Yom Tov, you shouldn't eat beans. That's the explanation that he gives. Most other authorities give explanations that relate specifically to Pesach. And they fit into the following. The following arguments are given. Number one, people might get mixed up. Flour is produced in a way that is quite similar to kitniyot. Kitniyot is produced in a way that you would make from it a flour. You go ahead and you leave it in the field and it has its chaff. In other words, there are similarities between the two. So explanation number one is that this decree, quote unquote, on kitniyot, on legumes, is because it is similar to wheat. That's explanation number one. Explanation number two is that the two of them were stored together. They were perhaps growing in fields next to one another. Mixture was common. So if I'm going to go ahead and eat rice on Pesach, there's a strong possibility that when I cook my rice, there might be some grain in it, and I'm going to have a serious problem. These are the explanations given. Now, there are two ways to look at it. Approach number one is that at some point in history, perhaps in the 12th century, a bunch of rabbis get together because of these issues that existed with legumes. They had a meeting, and they go out and they say, you know what? Due to these problems, we should make a decree that we no longer eat kitniyot. That's explanation number one. Explanation number two is that for some reason, Yiddish amames were not using kitniyot on Pesach. Rabbis were scratching their head, how on earth did that develop? So the rabbis are thinking they're in the base medrash, and they use their thumb. And one rabbi said, you know what, it could be that the reason it's prohibited is because it has similarities to grain. Another rabbi said, well, perhaps the reason they prohibited it is because it is stored like grain. So these explanations could be explanations that are post facto. So these are the two schools. And there's a very significant difference between these two approaches. And the difference would be, what happens if a new species shows up? A new species shows up. So if you argue that the prohibition is based on reason, so anything that would be fitting into the category of the reasons should be prohibited. If you take an approach that it's an irrational decree, and we gave explanations later, so irrational decrees only apply to that which was in existence during that decree. So therefore, there will be a question on modern ingredients. What are the modern ingredients that we have to address? Potatoes, corn, peanuts, and quinoa. These are 4, correct? And of course, they must be all the same. There cannot be logically a difference. So whatever you paskin about peanut should logically apply to quinoa, to potato, and to corn, right? The problem is that like everyone's like, wait a second, those things, like what happened, right? Where did the logic go? So that's what we're still searching for. But this is the reality that if you follow logic. Now, there was a great rabbi, for example, towards the end of the 19th century, a Rabbi Lomje. Any Lomje you didn't hear?
My mother-in-law was from
Lomje, okay. So Rabbi Malkiel Tenenbaum, who was a big posek, and he makes it very clear. He had a historical perspective. And he notes, Lo matzinu she'asu she'amdu chachamim leminyan. We have absolutely no record of rabbis getting together and prohibiting things. So therefore, in his mind, it is 100% clear that it is a custom that developed regarding specific items. We gave explanations to somehow logically explain why they became prohibited, but do not expand it beyond. So if something shows up later, it is not included. Okay, that's what this Rav of Lomje says. Another rabbi that follows that exact same philosophy was Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein was of the opinion, En lanu ela ma shemeforash, that which is stated among the earlier authorities, right, which includes, by the way, legumes, rice, mustard for some reason, that is what's included, that's what's mentioned in the 13th century, that you avoid. Everything else should be fine, and therefore he was of the opinion, Rav Moshe Feinstein, that peanuts should be 100% fine. He writes that if there's a minhag, I raise my hand, but if there is no minhag in a place, peanuts, Rav Moshe Feinstein was of the opinion, are 100% fine. The Rav Yaakov Emden, great 18th century authority and warrior, he shares with us his attitudes towards kitniot, and he notes that I am surprised that the rabbis never nullified it. That's what he said. And he shares with us a story that he was once traveling before Pesach, and he arrives in Mannheim. He arrives in Mannheim, in Germany, and there's a big to-do in the community. And he asks, what's the to-do about? And he is told that the local rabbis, there was no official rabbi at the time, but they had some kind of body of rabbis, have just decided that they are going to prohibit the new kitnios that showed up. No one has potatoes. So Rav Yaakov Emden said, this is crazy. And he made it his goal to prevent the rabbis in that community from prohibiting the potatoes. And he writes, thank God I succeeded in my mission, that in Mannheim, right, they continued eating potatoes. I prevented them from doing it. Meaning, he takes that approach as well. Limit it only to that which was mentioned in the 13th century, nothing more. So obviously, therefore, we eat potatoes. And obviously, we could technically eat peanuts. And obviously, it is permissible to eat, following the school, quinoa. It is permissible. Now, you're going to ask me, what about corn? I'll tell you that if you have a bad name, you're going to suffer. In Europe, corn was called Turkish Havitz, Turkish wheat. Why was it called Turkish wheat? Because it came from the Americas. And the merchants who brought it were the Turks, who controlled, in the 16th century, the Mediterranean. So it became known as Turkish wheat. Some people thought it grows in Turkey. Of course not. But as a result, if you call something wheat, what do you expect? That Jews are going to eat it on Pesach? So therefore, the Chassam Sofer actually had to argue with someone. There was one rabbi who believed that it's 100% wheat, and it's real chametz. So the Chassam Sofer had to argue with him that true, it's called wheat, but believe me, it's not wheat. He says, kidney is, okay, we have the tradition already, 100-year-old tradition, that it is considered kitniot. Why? It's called wheat, so what are we going to do about it? So that's why corn had some bad luck. There's one rabbi in Israel who notes how absurd it is that people are not eating corn and yes, eating quinoa, because they're basically the same thing. In South America, like if we would visit the Americas 800 years ago, what was eaten by the masses, what's in Mexico and further north was corn. In South America, it was quinoa. So basically it should be the same, because both of them did not exist in the old world. So it's very interesting that one of them, Nebuch, had a bad name. You have a bad name, you suffer. Quinoa, Baruch Hashem, we didn't call it Peruvian wheat or something. It's good we didn't give, or Bolivian wheat, because if we would have called it Bolivian wheat, quinoa would have been a loser. So it lost because it has a good name. So this is school number one. Okay, school number one. School number one would allow us to eat these things, there is no question. School number two is the school that we could argue starts with the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer tells us that you should know that there was a rabbinic decree on these items. But then he has a little bit of a problem. We have a rule, that the rabbis, many, many centuries ago, prohibited wine that was touched by a non-Jew. At that time, they they prohibited olive oil produced by a non-Jew. And this decree started to spread, but the masses just couldn't buy into it, right? People were getting good deals in Costco, and suddenly they're selling these tiny bottles of Liber and Rokeach olive oil for 3 times the price of the 2 gigantic ones in Costco. So the community said, this is a no-go, and therefore the rabbi said, you know what, we're backing off. Now you ask, how does that work? Well, there's a concept of a gzera she'en rov hatzibur yecholim la'amod ba. A decree that the majority of the congregation cannot accept and does not accept, the rabbis have to revisit it. So now, the Chassam Sofer asks on himself, if I am indeed arguing that in the 13th century, the rabbis got up and they clap on the shtender and they say, no more rice, no more legumes, no more mustard. So now, let's look at Klal Yisrael. Did Klal Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael, by the way, there are Jews outside of Europe. There were Jews at that time in Babylonia, in North Africa, in Spain, correct? They didn't accept it. They were the majority. So if you take the Chassam Sofer's approach, it is even more problematic because only the minority accepted it, and thus it should be nullified. So argues the Chassam Sofer with creativity, I should say. With creativity, he defends the practice and he calls it a tatalpush type of decree. What's a tatalpush? I'll share with you a story. The story goes as follows. In the beginning of the 3rd century, there is a rabbi in Israel, and his name is Rav. Some called him Rav Abba. He is a star disciple of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and obviously he could have remained in Israel at the time after the passing of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, but early in the 3rd century he decides that he has a mission in life to educate Jews. So he makes his way to Babylonia. He comes to Babylonia, and the locals expected him to be in the big city, the big Jewish city, called Naharda. And he says, nope, I have a good job. I want to reach out. I want to teach Jews. I'm going to go out to the suburbs, to area where there are no strong yeshivot, and I'm going to reach out and teach Jews. So he comes to a small city called Tatalpush. And as he walks into the store one day, he hears a woman asking another one, and she asks, tell me, what's the recipe for cooking a pound of meat? How much milk do you need? What's the recipe to cook a pound of meat? How much milk? So he faints. He realizes there's a problem here. And he makes a decree on the udder. You know, the animal's udder isn't really a mixture of meat and milk. Technically, it's permissible. He made a decree because he sensed that there's a problem here. Why? How did the problem develop? Well, in that community, everybody would always talk about basar b'cholov, basar b'cholov. So unfortunately, there were some people that were not educated, and they heard about basar b'cholov, right? So they thought it means you should be cooking the two together. That's how it developed, most probably. So he made a decree for that area. And the rule is that a local decree to deal with a local problem, you don't have to worry about the fact that the masses throughout the world do not accept it. You only look at it locally. That's what the Talmud seems to indicate. So the Chassam Sofer argues, and this is creative, that when the rabbis in Europe in the 13th century make a prohibition on those items that are either processed like grain, or stored with grain, or have grain mixtures, it was a local decree for Europe. So therefore, even though the majority of the world did not accept it, nevertheless it remains in play. Now, the Chassam Sofer's harsh stand is more of a reaction, because he is writing this in the 1820s. And in the 1820s, movements where he is living, there are movements to go ahead and change tradition. And he senses that I have to defend tradition. That's what the time requires. And therefore, I have a real understanding, and he writes straight out in his Shuvah, that I am writing it because, we are dealing with a world where people are ignoring Masoret. So that's what he notes. So now my question is, now that you have a little bit about the background, and I'm going to return to my question. How far back can I go? In other words, can I suddenly start allowing corn, claiming that the prohibition of corn was only because of the fact that in the late 17th century it had the wrong name? Can I allow it? Now, the concept, by the way, of information shortage played a very significant role in halacha. In other words, for example, last year, 2 years ago, we talked about the machine matzah versus the hand matzah. How did we come out with? Anyone remember? Machine, yeah. You have to be careful you tell that to, but that's what I believe. Now, shmura machine. It's not about shmura. Shmura machine with a good hashgacha is excellent. Now, the rabbi, we were focusing on Lemberg then, and the rabbi in Lemberg who allowed it was a Rabbi Yosef Shaul Natanzon, and he had the support of a Rabbi Schwabacher. Now, this Rabbi Schwabacher was a very interesting person. He was a rabbi doctor, and after leaving Lemberg, he lands up in Odessa. And in Odessa, one of the things he allowed for Pesach was sugar. He said that you could use sugar on Pesach. And this was a big to-do. And Reb Shlomo Kluger, who didn't like him probably from the matzah days, says that, this is a terrible leniency. How can you allow sugar? Now, what was the problem with sugar? Because the reality was that sugar, when it would come from the New World, they would come in barrels that often would carry beforehand some wheat, and it would be repackaged, so there was a little bit of wheat mixed into it. So people considered, in many communities, sugar as complete chametz, meaning they wouldn't even keep it in their domain during Pesach. Now, Rabbi Schwabacher notices in Odessa, by the end of the 19th century, that sugar is produced a little bit differently, that it no longer has that issue that they have designated containers, correct? Now, so sugar is one of those fascinating topics that there were communities that did not eat sugar, but nevertheless today, you don't say, well, there's a minhag not to eat sugar, right? The Ramah tells us not to eat sugar. How do we good Jews eat sugar? So obviously that was based on the realities that existed then and the information that they had then. So there is a concept that new information appears, right? How do we go ahead and deal with the new information? So what I want to do is prove or present an opinion based on a different area on Hilchot Pesach, and then I could perhaps return and share with you my feeling about minhagim. So the basic question is, how far back can I go? You all agree that I cannot go back 1,200 years and find a minhag in the old books and claim that I am reintroducing it. You all agree, I hope so, before the shul does it, that I do have the right to go back 25 years, right, and say you did it 25 years ago, the only reason you have not been doing it till now is not because you became very frum, but rather because it was just not available. I think you all agree that that would be fine. So how far back can I go? Can I go with the sesame oil? What about with the canola oil? Rapeseed oil, which is mentioned by the Maharsham, one of the great rabbinic authorities, the Pesach in Europe at the end of the 19th century. And he talks about the production of rapeseed oil, which is canola, and he basically notes that if it's produced dry and it's extracted dry, it's 100% fine. So what about that? Can I go back 120 years and reintroduce canola? These are questions that I think about, right? So I'm going to go ahead and turn into a different area in halacha. There was a minhag. There was a minhag that probably died about 250, maybe 300 years ago, that for the Seder night, people would bake their 3 matzos, and the volume of those 3 matzos would be 43.2 eggs altogether, meaning each matzah had the volume of 14.4 eggs. Wow, mega matzahs, right? Mega matzahs. Now, how? The cholesterol? No, the volume, not the eggs themselves, the volume. Libby Znaimer, by the way, on 96.3 says that it's not so bad eggs. I think it's 96.3 or 91.1. So she paskined. And again, it's against the minhag that you always believe that eggs are terrible. That's an interesting shiloh. Now, how did that minhag come up? So it works as follows. In the days of the temple, when you wanted to show your appreciation to the Rabbono Shel Olam, you would bring the Korban Todah. The Korban Todah was an offering that you would come into the temple with 40 breads, 40 loaves, we'll call them. 4 of them would be given to the Kohen. You walk away with 36. Out of the 36 that you walk away with, 9 of them were chametz, 27 were matzah, okay, different types of matzah. And the volume, if I would take 3 matzos out of them, right, the volume of each one on its own was 14.4. And what I'm trying to get to, you don't have to remember these numbers, is that Pesach in some ways is a korban todah. We are showing our appreciation to the Almighty. And therefore we wanted to make those loaves, which we call matzah, to have the same volume of the matzahs of a Thanksgiving offering. So now, true that it's a little bit different than a traditional Thanksgiving meal, and I mean our Thanksgiving meal. Why is it different? Because a regular Thanksgiving meal that you would have, that you would come to the table and you would say, see some breads that were matzah, and see some breads that were chametz, because that's what a korban todah would have. The Seder night, you come to the table and you only have the matzah. And Abarbanel explains that that's what the Manishtana's question is. That the child asks on all other nights when we have such a gathering, and all other nights when we have this wonderful get-together to show our appreciation, we have chametz u'matzah. This night, it looks like a Thanksgiving get-together, a Thanksgiving dinner, but halayla zeh kulo matzah. So there is a very close relationship between this Thanksgiving, and therefore the loaves get their volume. Now, for me, when I saw it the first time, and I started calculating the size of a matzah, especially when today they argue that the traditional square matzah, you'll forgive me, has about the volume of 2 eggs. So therefore, suddenly you're going to have to multiply it by 7. So each matzah, how on earth would you bring it into the house? It just made absolutely no sense to me earlier on. Later on, I realized that I'm looking at it wrong, because 700 years ago, 600 years ago, 500 years ago, 400 years ago, the matzah was thicker. The matzah was thicker. The matzah was more like a pita. And this is a fact. It's interesting that there was a great rabbi in Metz, Rabbi Yaakov Reischer, and he notes, and he passed away in 1733, and he writes that you should not make your matzah too thick. And he notes, yesh ligor, you should go ahead and be very critical of those people who make their matzah as thick as a tefach. A tefach is about 3 inches. So he warns people that it's a serious problem, because there are those who are making their matzah as thick as 3 inches. Okay, did you ever see a matzah of 3 inches? Of course not. Did you ever see a matzah of a half an inch? I doubt it. So, but that clearly indicates to you that it was much thicker. And then I have this interest of trying to figure out when did it occur? That's question number 1. When? Question number 2 is why? So it's interesting that I find there was an authority, Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margaliot, passed away in 1820. So he's writing this, let's say, around 1795, where he thanks the Rabbanu Shalom that achsher dari, meaning that the generation is becoming better, that people are not making avot matzot that are thick. So that indicates that by 200 years ago, they're becoming thinner. But even then, that does not mean cracker-like. It probably means that it was not thicker than a finger. Okay, but it was not cracker-like. So therefore, that gives you a little bit of an understanding why authorities of 300-400 years ago would tell you that the matzah has the volume of 14 eggs. So now comes the following question. A few years ago, someone decided that they want to start making thicker matzah, soft matzah for Pesach. Okay, the Sephardim, by the way, have it, so we could do it as well. So they turned to halachic authorities to give their approval. So the authority they turned to in New York is a very well-respected rabbi. We had the privilege of welcoming him here several times, and that is Rav Herschel Schechter from Yeshiva University, a tremendous Torah scholar. And he was asked what his belief is, and he notes that if it is produced correctly, a thick matzah, a soft matzah, is 100% fine. Absolutely no problem. He's asked, but what about the problem of minhag? Meaning we all agree in our lifetime, right, that we haven't seen those thick matzahs among Ashkenazi communities. What about the problem of minhag? So Rav Herschel Schechter responds, imagine you have a shul, and the shul for 150 years always had a gray parochus. And then someone made a donation to the shul, and they purchased a blue parochus. Are you going to say that you are violating a minhag by changing it from gray to blue? Obviously not, he writes. So therefore, in his opinion, this concept of having only cracker-like matzah is true that we've been doing it for the past 100 years or so, but that is not considered a minhag, and he believes that there is absolutely no problem in reintroducing the soft, not a tefach and not a half a tefach, but rather a soft matzah. So this is a very interesting insight, at least for me, because I suddenly have a source of a great rabbinic thinker that gives me a level of allowance to go further back with a minhag. Perhaps, right? Perhaps. Any thoughts on that?
Why haven't they done it?
So they're doing it, actually. They're doing it. Is it becoming more popular? And they have to realize that there's difficulty with storage. In other words, the matzos that they produce cracker-like are easy to store. They sit on the shelf, I hope only for a couple of months, but I have a feeling even longer, right? But on the other hand, as soon as you make them thicker, you're going to have to freeze them, right? You're going to have to be sure to bake them not too much in advance before Pesach. So there's more, the logistics are problematic. But it's fine, and I think there's a website. Go ahead, do your research. I don't know if they'll ship it to here or not, but the reality is that the product is in the marketplace. Yes?
The difference between, I would think the difference between a real minhag and, let's say, this thing of the color of the parochas is that the minhag has, at some point, a connection with some source, right? And the color of the parochas, there is no source, as far back as you go, ever.
Very valid point, and it's more than that. In other words, the way I would see it is that when it comes, why did they start making it thinner? Well, the truth is, when you bake something thick, there's always that concern that the section in the middle will remain unbaked, and that becomes chametz. So they did have a halachic basis for making it thinner. And it seems to me that Rav Herschel Schechter believes that even if there's a halachic basis, if you are able to produce it in a valid way, in a way that avoids that problem, even though we haven't been doing it for 120 years, it is fine. So it's interesting, and therefore he brings the parochas more, just as the parochas is simple to us, he argues that in his view, the matzah is the same. So that's why he brings it, even though I also on the surface...
Did someone say stop making thick matzahs, or is they just sort of
So,
dwindle into oblivion?
interesting question. It's in the Ra'avad, 12th century authority. He makes a recommendation that we should make our matzot rekikin. Rekikin. Now, rekikin, what are rekikin? Well, we translate them as crackers. Maybe in modern Hebrew is the word used, rekikin? Okay, so I always assume cracker-like. So I used to think that it's a suggestion already in the 12th century to make it thin. As I read through the literature, I have a feeling that what he means is don't make it as thick as 3 inches, make it thinner, perhaps like a finger. So therefore, the idea of making it cracker-like perhaps has no halachic source. Making it thin and not thicker than a finger, that is mentioned and it is stated. And therefore people and rabbis like Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margaliot take great pride in the fact that we no longer make it thicker than a finger. That's probably how Shachter reads it. And therefore the cracker, like he believes, has no halachic basis, but rather it's for a practical production. I think as they introduced the machine, perhaps they made it thinner. I don't know the complete history. I think there's some holes there. But nevertheless, that's the approach he is taking, and therefore he gave a green light for that item. By the way, for me, and my olive oil, and it's funny I said olive oil because there was a time in Jerusalem in the 18th century that even olive oil became problematic because they visited facilities where the Arabs were processing it. And the Arabs, as they're processing it, when it comes to the break, they were dipping their pita into the olive oil. Right? Would you really want an Arab's pita saliva? Odds are not. And it makes you realize what food production, how different it was in those days. Hopefully. In other words, I see something Chinese, I would be very nervous. And
tried by the State Department.
Yeah. So. And then the sugar, for example, when they talk about the production of sugar, right? They mentioned the problem as well, that workers were dipping. I mean, you tell me, in those days they didn't have spreads. You're dealing with dry bread. You work in a sugar factory. Come on, wouldn't you dip your bread in sugar? I mean, it is expected. And what occurred... What?
The concept of hashgacha. That's not a concept.
So, hashgacha is a new concept. Correct. Hashgacha is a new concept. Most items in the marketplace in the 16th century were not produced without hashgacha. There were things that people avoided either because of rumors or because of concerns. And the concept of hashgacha, one of the first things I found that actually there's an idea of hashgacha is actually sugar. What they would make the sugar cones that they would use like these clippers, to break off pieces. That was produced under hashgacha. In Berlin, they developed a system that throughout the years these cones of sugar were round, but for Pesach they made them more of a triangle. And that was their hashgacha, and then so sugar is one of those first items that comes in with hashgacha. But in those eras, that everything was based on concerns and rumors, people did not eat, for example, dried fruit because of the concern that they place flour on the equipment of drying. Garlic, there are those even today, if I understand.
Beer.
What?
They fertilized it with beer.
No,
Beer.
because it was grown in the wheat field.
Grown in the wheat fields. Beer was actually about with the cloves. That they found that in Amsterdam, that they used to add beer to cloves. So it's amazing the amount of food that is followed, different eras, different concerns. But back to my peanut oil, I believe that it is far less of a problem than the matzah, meaning due to the fact that people in this room used it. And the only reason you don't use it, or you did not use it over the past 20, 25 years, is only due to the fact that it's not available. I believe that there's absolutely no halachic problem at all in reintroducing it. There's just a